So, hi everyone. Welcome to the 22nd International Primatology Lecture on Past, Present, and Future Perspectives of the Field, brought to you by the Center for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology at Kyoto University. In this series, we invite distinguished scientists from across the globe and ask them to reflect on their career trajectories in relation to the historical development of the field of primatology. And we hope their stories will inspire you to think about the future directions for this field. Today's lecture will be archived on our YouTube channel, so you can follow us on SciCast YouTube channel. And after this lecture, there will be time for Q&A. So if you are watching this on YouTube, please feel free to type your comments and questions in the chat box at any point during the lecture. So now, Dr. Mike Huffman will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Colin Chapman.
Thanks, Susumu. Colin, welcome. It's always a pleasure to see you, to talk with you, and to work with you as we have many times over the years. The first time I met you, I think, was when we were both in Canada. I don't know if it was it was probably in Edmonton. I think you were a master's student of Linda Fettigan's, and I was collaborating with her on many things, so I would visit often. And I still remember that day. Linda was very proud to introduce you to me, and I was very happy to meet you, of course, and that started things off, which is probably many years back now. But as the introduction in the text that you were all sent says all about the different activities Colin is involved in, we'll hear a lot about that in his presentation. But he has many fellows, different statuses in many countries around the world, which really speaks to his international stance and his international standing. But on top of all the fellows and the fellowships he's had, he's a really great fellow. And I think that's what's special about this talk today. I'm very happy for all of you to have a chance to get to know Colin Chapman and the work that he's done. With that embarrassment to you, I'll hand it over to you, Colin. The show is yours.
Okay, thanks, Mike. That wasn't so embarrassing. I knew you had a lot more embarrassing stories you could say, so thank you very much for not embarrassing too much. So for me, it's tonight. It's not night to a lot of people, but I'd like to basically tell you a few fun things I've learned over the years studying primates. And we're going to go slowly because I'm going to have to say next slide to each of them, and you'll see there's lots of slides. So next slide. So this is a brief kind of outline of what I'm going to call my journey. I'm going to give you a very brief history of kind of the journey because I'm not really too interested in myself. So I'm not going to go into detail. Then I'm going to tell you what motivated my research and what continues to motivate my research. And that's something I think is important. And then I'll tell you about something like my 34 years of trying to understand what determines primate abundance. And obviously that has important conservation implications. And then what I think is the most important part of the talk, I'm going to talk about some fun lessons I've learned over the years. So next. So if you could think of a city in the world that's furthest from primates, you probably would think of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And that's where I come from. So the little star there represents where I was born. Next slide. And that's me at the age of something like 4. And I always liked watching animals. And basically my life involved me just following that passion. So nice cowboy hat at the age of 4. Next slide. So when I was in kind of my 3rd year of undergrad, I got a summer project to understand what determines spruce grouse population size. And that basic question has stuck with me for all my career. And that's basically what I'll be talking about throughout kind of the talk today. Next slide. When I finished my undergrad, I got a grant from the Canadian government to travel from Edmonton, Alberta, all the way down into Central America. And the idea was to look for possible primate research study sites that I could work on for my degree. There is no way in the world that the Canadian government would today give me such a grant, and nor would they, any university, allow me to do that sort of travel. But it was a great adventure. I traveled through Guatemala through the height of its civil war. I survived a number of adventures, which I will not tell you about because a lot of them are embarrassing, but I made it. And that was a very formative episode when basically I was just finishing an undergrad. Next slide. So that leads to what motivates my research. Next. So during my trips, I saw the plight of many primate populations. And this is what motivated my research over the next decade. So I saw scenes like this throughout Mexico, Guatemala, etc. Next. Well, in 1962, so basically just after I was born, a French researcher said, unfortunately, at the very moment when we are becoming aware of the uniqueness of primates, we are also realizing how precarious is the future of the primates, and to what point competition with industrial man is threatening their survival. He went on to say, can we remain unmoved at this annihilation? Next. And the answer is yes, we were unmoved. Nothing much happened for 20 to 30 years after that statement was made. It was only in 1980 that journal Conservation Biology was started, and the field only gained momentum in the 1990s. For many of you, that's going to be hard to believe because there are now so many different journals, etc. But the field is very young. So what is the situation now? So this is an image of my field site in Kibale National Park in Uganda. And it's a beautiful, pristine rainforest that's wonderful to work in. Next. This is an image that's coming up of another tropical rainforest. And this is what forest could look like. A great contrast. Next. In general, about 60 million hectares of tropical forest was lost between the year 2000 and 2019. So the millions of hectares is just too abstract for me. I can think of a hectare, it's about the size of a football field. What this equates to is about the size of the island of Madagascar or twice the size of Japan. Mm-hmm. So huge areas are lost in those in less than 20 years. Next. This tropical forest would have supported something like 15 million primates. This is a nice Japanese macaque, but those, we literally meant the death of 15 million primates. Next. I think a picture is worth more than 1,000 words, so I'll give you a couple of pictures of deforestation. This is the Borneo from 1950 to 2020. And of course, green represents forest. Yellow represents deforestation, and you can see the picture for yourself. Next. This is an image coming up of Ivory Coast, 1990, and just 50, basically 25 years later, there's almost nothing left. Next. This is Brazil, which is, of course, got the huge Amazon rainforest, still mostly left. But I'd like to point out the Atlantic forest. So the forest to the lower half of the slide, it's basically gone. Next. So this deforestation of the tropics releases that giant number of metric tons of carbon, which is 6 times the amount of carbon released by all the cars and trucks in Canada a year. So that really shows you how important these forests are for climate change and carbon sequestration. Next. These estimates do not involve the loss from bushmeat hunting. Next. This is an image from the back of a truck in Congo. You can see primates kind of lined in the back of the truck. Next. This is an image basically that shows a chimpanzee. We tried to get a picture just of the chimpanzee, but the kids wanted to get in the way. And the chimpanzee was destined for the stew pot. Next. This is an image of how you typically buy bushmeat in Africa. It's often smoked because they have to smoke the meat to get it to the market. And this is how you'd often buy it. Next. This does not mention the kind of collateral damage. This is a chimpanzee that's lost her fingers because they were caught in a snare, and this occurs time and time again. The animal steps in a snare, pulls their hand away from it, and can lose their fingers. Next. Let's put this in perspective, though. I always like to think about things in a broader perspective. So the bushmeat harvested from Central Africa represents about 2 million tons of bushmeat. So this is about 5 million cattle, so a huge number of cows. Or let's put it in terms of hamburgers. We all know what a hamburger is. That's 77 billion hamburgers. But an interesting kind of comparison is the people in the US eat that many hamburgers in just 50 days. So yes, it's a lot of meat being harvested, but not a lot of meat compared to what people are taking out of basically eating in the United States. Next. This estimate does not involve the what's going to happen with climate change. And you'll get a couple of quick slides in a row. Next. So the Earth's climate change is warmed by about 1 degree in the past 100 years. And some estimates say climate will warm by 4.5 in this century. This year is the hottest year ever recorded to date. Next. So this is predicted warming. So you're going to see 4 slides quite in a row. This is areas that are predicted to warm. So you can look at the different areas. So the Himalayas, for example, is going to predict it to warm a lot. So look at the areas and then look at your kind of favorite primate area and you can compare it. The next slide, will be the number of species found in an area. So you might have noticed that climate change in the Congo is not going to be too bad. So that's great. And there's lots of species there. So great. Madagascar is not the same. Climate change is going to be high and there's lots of species. Next. So again, this is the predicted climate warming. And next slide. These are the number of endangered species. So again, Madagascar is going to be a critical area for primate conservation, as will southwestern China, places like Borneo. Next slide. I'd like to kind of emphasize that people often talk about climate change in terms of temperature. What I predict is probably more important for primates is what's going to happen in terms of precipitation. So areas such as the Yucatan Peninsula, Costa Rica, those sorts of areas which are already dry are predicted to become even drier. So this is going to be a particularly severe problem for many primate regions. And it leads to a number of scary predictions. So next slide. So this is one scary prediction. And there's so many scary predictions out there, but this is a prediction that was made by some tropical ecologists that I really respect. They suggest that 75% of all tropical forests presented in the year 2001 will experience temperatures that are higher than what presently supports close-up canopy forest by the turn of the century. So that's a pretty scary prediction. Next slide. So let's move on to kind of my last 30, 34 years trying to understand what to do in primate abundance. And it's hard to put this in a few slides, but let's go for it. Next slide. So I my research has been kind of focused on change. And I don't want to just document change. I want to understand and predict it. If you document change, you can say, oh, we lost a bunch of primates. If you understand change, you can say, oh, we lost a bunch of primates because they were hunted or because of climate change. If we can predict it, we can say we will lose a bunch of primates because of this factor, and we can then make modifications in whatever we're doing, our conservation and management strategies, to prevent that. So I'm always trying to predict change. And I think that's really important. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about change in terms of forest change, climate change, and the impact on primate populations. Next. So in 1989, as a young postdoc, I went to Uganda. So that's in East Africa. Went to Kibola National Park, which is in the west. And that's where basically I fell in love with the place, and I've been there ever since. Next slide. During that first year, I basically set up a series of vegetation plots, and I've been monitoring those vegetation plots ever since, every few years, until 2 years ago. Next slide. With that data, I've been able to say how the forest has been changing. And I can say that primates themselves are generating change. So this is an image of a black and white colobus eating flowers of a plant. Next slide. If you eat all the flowers, the plant can't set fruit. And so this is Markhamia density over time. So basically 1989 to 2021. And you can see a general decline. Markhamia is one of the biggest food plants that the colobus like. What's happened is basically they've eaten all the flowers. If you eat the flowers, the plant doesn't set fruit. If it doesn't set fruit, you basically have no seeds, and the plant can slowly decline because adults are not replaced. If you go into the neighboring kind of villages where Markhamia is found in forest fragments and there's no primates, you find Markhamia fruiting, flowering, and lots of seedlings. So primates are basically causing the demise of their own forest. Next slide. In Kibale, also, the forest is changing because of elephants. Next slide. Elephants are increasing in abundance. Next slide. In Africa, in general, elephants are declining, but in Kibale, this is perfect. Elephant numbers are increasing. This is because Kibale is a nicely established national park, and we're getting elephant immigration, actually. So if elephant numbers increase, next slide, what happens is they change the forest. Elephants will eat the bark off of trees, such as the animals doing here. They trample seedlings. They basically damage the tree component of the forest quite significantly. And they can shift the forest from being forest to more of a savanna system. Next slide. So elephants and primates are changing. What about climate change? So, in 1989, I never set out to study climate change, but I studied climate and I studied change, so I could put the two together. People weren't really talking about climate change back in 1989. So I'm going to talk about kind of 4 aspects of climate change. Next slide. So Kibale's climate is changing. It's receiving 300 millimeters more rainfall a year than the start of the century. Next slide. This is an image of the rainfall change over time. Next slide. Kibale is also experiencing less frequent droughts and earlier onset of the rainy season, and its temperature has increased by about 1.1 degrees, its monthly temperature. Next slide. We've been able to show that influences plant chemistry. Next slide. So it's really some elegant greenhouse experiments that basically look at the effect of increasing temperature, increasing rainfall, and increasing carbon dioxide on plant chemistry. So in a greenhouse, you can change the temperature, you can change the rainfall by adding more water, or you can seal the whole greenhouse and increase carbon dioxide. And if you do that in a greenhouse, you find that plants decrease the amount of protein they produce, they increase the amount of fiber they produce, and they increase the amount of tannins they produce. Tannins are a secondary compound that binds proteins, so it takes basically proteins away from the animals. Next slide. So what collaborators and I, particularly Jessica Rothman and I, demonstrated was that comparing leaf chemistry from 1994 to 2009, what happened in the field, so not in a greenhouse, actual trees growing in the field, the monkeys were eating, the fiber content were increasing, the protein content was decreasing. This means the quality of the food was declining. Next slide. So what's the impact of this on primates? Next. So I studied red colobus, next. And black and white colobus, next. And we studied them at a series of locations throughout Kibale. And I'm just going to point out one particular location, the Dura River site, which is in the middle of the park. It's a beautiful, pristine riverine forest. Not much human intervention, but notice the first two bars. Those are the columbine populations. Next slide. So I was trying to understand what determined their abundance. So I said, okay, well, let's correlate colobus biomass to the cumulative DBH of food trees. DBH is diameter breast height. It's the cumulative size of the food trees. And there's a really nice relationship, except for the Dura River site. So it seems like while there's lots of food, there's not many monkeys. So I'll come back to this point at the end of the talk. Early on, I said, well, maybe it's predation. The population got decimated by predation, or a disease came through. And I published that in the journal Primates in 1999. And then I went, yeah, I'm kind of throwing out a data point when I don't have very many data points. So next slide. Well, columbines have different digestive system than most primates. They can basically digest fiber better. They have a more kind of saculated forestomach. Next slide. So I went back and I looked at the biomass again, so same data for 4 of the sites versus the quality of the food. And I defined that as protein to fiber. So what seems to happen, but the food that's available is very low in protein and very high in fiber. So what I suggested was, hey, quality isn't everything. Quantity is everything, quality matters. Next slide. So I spent the next, I can't remember, something like 25 years collecting a series of other points. And if I was a manager and I went to them and said, I have 4 data points and you should change your management plan because of these 4 data points, hopefully they're laughing at me. So I collected all these data points. And basically I showed that I can predict colobus biomass based on the quality of the food. And I explained it 87% of the biomass I can explain. Next slide. So also looked at changing fruiting patterns. Next slide. So for the frugivores in Kibale, what's happening with climate change? What we showed is that, remember, average rainfall is increasing in Kibale. With average rainfall, you get basically more clouds. With more clouds, you get less ripe fruit. Next slide. So that just shows the rainfall again in Kibale. Next slide. So the rainfall is getting more, the fruit is getting less. We've also shown that wet conditions allow parasite eggs to persist longer and thus increase infections. So basically, it's becoming a more disease-ridden environment in many ways. Next slide. Somewhat independent of climate change, we've also shown that we know that people are increasing coming into contact with primates, and this leads to parasite transmission. We've shown this conclusively with E. coli and with other gastrointestinal parasites. Next slide. Okay, so we have some forest change, climate change. What's the primate population doing? This is kind of the punchline. This is the exciting part. So what are the primates doing? Next slide. So forests are changing in a way that primates should not like. The climate's changing, increasing negative quality foods, more parasites, everything's getting worse. What are the primates doing? They're doing just fine. You know, this is the different primate populations from 1996 to almost present, just last year. And what you see is basically the primates are oscillating a little bit. That's probably due to partially sampling area, but the primates are doing just fine. So they are being flexible in their responses. What's happening? I need another few years to figure it out, but I'll figure it out. Next slide. So this is just the punchline. The primates population should be declining. So the food is getting scarce, less nutritious, and they have more diseases, but they're more stable. So next slide. This kind of leads to the fun part of the thing. What are some of the fun lessons I've learned? And I think in many ways, this is the most important part of the talk. So next slide. So my first kind of take-home message is nature is complex. So don't just look for simple correlations. Lots of things are happening. If I look for a simple correlation with rainfall, I might get one, but that wouldn't have explained things. So keep an open mind, look for lots of different things. Lots of things are going to be changing. Reviewers hate that. You'll have a hard time getting things published. You say this changes, that changes. But nature's complex. To understand things, you have to look at lots of things. Next slide. This is kind of one of my fun things. Mistakes happen, so don't worry. Science is a process of learning. So you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to publish mistakes. You're going to make potentially big errors. Hopefully not too big, but you're going to make errors. Just don't worry about it. Just say, hey, I made an error. I got it wrong. So in 1995, I wrote a paper that states that these collis monkeys are upper canopy specialists. So they only came to the upper canopy. They never came to the ground. They never came to mid canopy. In reality, they're just not habituated yet. And so we now see them on the ground all the time. So I was totally wrong in 1995. Next slide. I think one of the most important things I've learned is the value of collaboration and a value of really honest collaboration. So I've looked at things about nutrition, disease, hormones, tree community change, climate change, and I could not have done this without a series of great collaborators who taught me a lot and a series of great students who also taught me a lot. So collaboration is key. And I can't emphasize it much. Don't think about competition. Think about collaboration. If you compete with people, it doesn't help. If you collaborate with people, you'll get much further. Next slide. One thing I want to kind of emphasize, because I don't think researchers understand it enough. That's my bias statement. But we need to build research capacity. For example, much of the professors in Africa have limited training. In Ethiopia, only 6% of the university faculty hold PhDs. In South Africa, only 39% of the faculty hold PhDs. So we need to build research capacity. Right now, the starting salaries of professors are pretty low. That's the monthly salaries for a number of countries. So that's something that myself in North America, Japan, I think can really help with in the future. Next slide. This image illustrates my point, actually. So this is the kind of the tiers or echelons about the number of publications on conservation published by different countries. And so you can see the ranking. And what we found, this is a study done by Peng-Fei Fan, is that 12% of the 193 countries accounted for 90% of the publications, and the United States accounted for 42% of the conservation publications. So if you're a country in pink or salmon or whatever it is, so Canada, the US, Great Britain, Germany, China, or Australia, you account for 90% of the country publication in conservation. If you're in Africa, there's very few publications on conservation. And we all know that we need to have local knowledge contributing to conservation actions, which I think means that the countries in pink have to try to build a capacity in Africa and elsewhere. Next slide. Okay, this is kind of something that I just kind of feel myself. Just keep going. Whenever you kind of start research, just keep going. And if you just keep going, you'll have long-term research, and long-term research is valuable. I didn't set out to study climate change. I didn't set out to study forest change. I just kept going. It's a simple statement. I wasn't brilliant back in 1989. I'm not brilliant now, but I just kept going. So that's kind of a good punchline. Next slide. And this is one I'll spend a little bit more time on. Many small conservation acts make a difference. So next slide. So this is kind of going to illustrate some of the conservation things that I do. I'm going to start off by saying I do not do law enforcement. If I did law enforcement, people wouldn't talk to me. So I do not study law enforcement, but law enforcement is needed. Next slide. We can do the science. So we demonstrated that if you understand the nutritional quality of an environment, you can predict Colin's biomass. Next slide. We use this data to apply it to conservation. So in Kibale, about 140 square kilometers of the south was degraded, was cut down for agriculture. This is a banana field adjacent to the forest. So we had 140 square kilometers of degraded forest. Next slide. We worked with a carbon offset project. Next slide. And we planted in to these degraded forests 1.9 million seedlings. That's a huge number of seedlings, and the local community was paid to do this. So it was a community project. Next slide. 20 years later, the primate populations in the restored forest about equal that of the old growth forest. It's 8% lower, just 8%. And this is an image of the regenerating forest next to the old growth forest. Next slide. Something I can't emphasize enough is the importance of training. So I've tried to do a bunch in my career, but the individual below is Arthur Magisha. He was one of my students. He became the executive director of the Uganda Wildlife Authority. He put in action just so many wonderful conservation laws, policies of the Park Service. And, I think what you do in training can have so many cascading effects. Next slide. I think you can work with groups like National Geographic. And I've worked with National Geographic for 9 years. And it's amazing, kind of how much information you get across to the public. And I really believe that's important. So as much as I can, I deal with news agencies, difficult at times, but I deal with news agencies, groups like National Geographic. Getting across the public is vital because those public are the people who basically make donations. That's wonderful. They also vote. They vote for conservation actions or not. Next slide. You can work with communities. Next slide. So this is Joseph Berahunga. Joseph is the local kind of village chief in the community that we work with. This is Joseph's second wife and his, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 children of his second wife. But as you can see, Joseph is not very wealthy. Joseph is actually wearing my jacket for this picture. So next slide. These are the people that are impacting the forest. They're setting snares. This is a field that's removing a snare. Next slide. These are the people that are taking firewood from the forest. So next slide. Taking firewood, next. So we tried to think about how we could work with this community. So we've done things like set up ecotourism projects. So early on with Richard Wrangham, we helped set up the chimpanzee ecotourism in the park. And this is a very successful project. Mike Huffman can talk about it. Next slide. One thing I was kind of pondered on, because could we help the health of the local community? So 26% of the children under the age are malnourished. Next slide. Children are also basically suffering from malaria, which can easily be treated or prevented. Next slide. And the average distance to the nearest hospital is 10 kilometers. This is a woman who's pregnant getting on the back of a bicycle. I have no idea what that would be like. I've never been pregnant. I've never got on the back of a bicycle in that condition, but it can't be fun. Next slide. So could we help the health of the local community? Next slide. So what we did is we hold a bunch of benefit dinners. Next. A bunch of different types of fundraisers back in North America. We built a clinic. Next. We hired Nurse Dennis, who still works with us today, 15 years later. Next. And we opened the clinic. You'll notice a bunch of North American students here. Those North American students helped fund the project for 10 years until COVID. They basically ran fundraisers for 10 years to help pay for the clinic. After COVID, it's all kind of been on my shoulders to get grants to do it. Next slide. We raised a grant to get a mobile clinic. So send an ambulance from Canada over to Uganda that basically, instead of being in one location, this clinic, the mobile clinic goes all the way around the park, giving healthcare conservation messages to the whole park. Next slide. Okay, so I think this is my most important slide, is in your career, if I'm going to make one thing of advice, which I guess part of the idea of this whole thing is to kind of say what you've learned. I have to say, the biggest thing I've learned is to have fun. If you don't have fun, and I've seen a lot of academics not have fun, you're not going to continue. So make sure in your career you have fun, you enjoy it, you make others have fun. That's the biggest lesson I've learned. Next slide. Okay, with that, I'm happy to take questions. So we can stop the slideshow. Okay, questions for anybody?
Thank you very much, Dr. Chapman. So we have plenty of time for Q&A now, and I just want to remind the YouTube audience to add comments and questions in the chat box. But let's start with focus on Zoom first. So if any of you have any questions or comments, you can raise your hand.
I have one, if that's okay, to get us started. Thanks, Colin. That's it's super. It's always interesting to hear you, but also see all of that in one kind of place put together. And you mentioned it briefly at the end, but post-COVID, it's on you to find money to continue to support the community service you do around Kibale. And so I wonder how, if you could comment on how that's been going.
Do you want a nice statement or the reality?
Well,
it's not going well. I'm finding it much harder to raise funding. There's quite a few foundations that are actually closing their doors. A lot of foundations are spending out. I subscribe to a kind of a foundation newsletter, which kind of sends trends in funding. And what's happening is there's a lot of the small foundations are spending out. My guess is that funding in general is increasing, but funding to big groups are increasing. Funding to smaller groups like myself and our team is decreasing. So the Bezos, the Amazon, Facebook, there's more money there, but that's not going to the smaller groups. And I'll say in my bias, I suspect that a lot of the big money gets spent up in administration and doesn't go to the field. 100% of the funds that are given to me goes to the field.
Mm-hmm.
There's no administrative cost. So it's getting harder.
Yeah.
So what's happened with the ambulance, the mobile clinic then? Is how affected by is that affected by the lack of support? The real answer, of course.
The mobile clinic right now is broken down. So we're basically using a minibus until we get parts. So the clinic is still running. We have good funding for the clinic year after year. We've run it for over 15 years, probably almost 20 years. So that's still going. Mobile clinic is breaking down. But we have other projects. So what I've done in my career with the conservation projects is I move from one to the other. And the idea is to have a project, start it up, make it sustainable, and then move on to another project. So we started up, first of all, ecotourism projects around crater lakes. So tourists could come to the region, go see chimps, become tired, sit by a crater lake, enjoy the monkeys, swim in the lake. And we started a number of very small scale projects like that. Those are still running. With Richard Wrangham and Uganda Wild Authority, we started the chimpanzee project. And of course, nowadays, Richard and I are no longer really involved, but it's a multi-million-dollar project. The idea is to start them and turn them over to the local people to run. We've been successful in some of them, not turning over all of them, but we keep trying. And I have some really new, exciting new projects that we're conservation projects we're starting. And give me another 10 years, I'll see if we turn them over.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have a question from a graduate student, Zihong. Well, Zihong, would you like to speak, or do you want me to summarize your question? Okay. So basically, he's asking for your advice, Dr. Chapman, for graduate students who may be struggling in the field to collect enough data to answer their research questions, especially given the time constraint of, let's say, 5 years for a PhD, and things may not be going as well as they had planned originally.
A very tough question. I think the answer is, my thoughts on that is, most good questions require lots of time to answer. In my experience, after 5 years, said, "Oh, I need another decade." So after a decade, they said, "Oh, I need another decade." Of course, if you're a PhD student or any student, you don't have that time. So I think the answer is, okay, what can you say after your period of time? And I think the answer always is, you can say more than someone who hasn't thought about it. So it's not, you're never going to be able to answer the question. I can't answer the question after 30 some odd years. As my talk demonstrated, you can't answer the question. But I can say more than someone who didn't spend that time. So think about the fact, what unique contributions can you make? And I think if you think about that, you'll realize there are some really, you have something to say. So yeah, think about what you have to say. What have you learned?
All right. So more questions from the Zoom audience?
I have a filler, if it's okay. Of course, I have many, so I don't want to talk too much. But I'm curious because one of the main outcomes of your 30 plus years of study is that the population of those primates seems pretty stable at Kibale, which is really interesting. There's not even that much variation, right, year to year. And I wonder if you can put that in a bigger context. We've had Karen Stryer, for example, talking about the murkies, and there was massive increases in the population, massive decreases in the population, and back up again. And I made the comment earlier, it kind of looks like, if you zoom in and out, like a stock market. Right. It's quite different from the Kibale case. So I wonder, in the region more generally, in Africa, in the world, how do you think about those results?
I think the answer is scale. So I have two papers that are, one's just coming out and one might be coming out, depending on the reviewers, which are basically 30 to 50 year assessments of primates in different areas in Kibale. And if you look at one area of Kibale, you can see change, some drastic changes, population crashes. If you look at Kibale in general, so wide scale, does fine. So, those population crashes in one area are not reflected on a larger scale. Karen Stryer, she's studying a very endangered species in forest fragments, but she's studying forest fragments. She's not studying 800 square kilometers. What happens on a small scale does not equate to what happens on a large scale. So you have lots of fluctuations happening for a variety of reasons, but we need to understand the large scale, which I'm going to point out is almost never studied. So if you look at a study of primate population dynamics that's done in detail, not a single point, recce type study, they're almost always on one area or monitoring, single groups over, decades, but a single group, or they use very, very bad methods. I'm just going to criticize that field a bit because census methodology is very poor. We understand how to use those methods. I can explain that to people in more detail, but our ability to census primate populations is very poor.
Do you have any advice for any folks out there wanting to census primates? I mean, each field site will have a very different set of circumstances for what kinds of tools and observational approaches can be used.
I fear my advice is often logistically not possible. So the advice would be, do your censuses over a very long period of time, do them very intensively, and do them over a large scale. And so we're talking about, having, I don't know, every 5 years having $20,000 to $30,000 to do a census, and that's not realistic. So my advice, I don't know, that's what's needed. But good luck. And I've struggled so much over the decades getting funding, and I'm still struggling. But to do long-term research and to do censuses, you really need a lot of effort over long periods of time. And anyone who's really interested in that, I'd really be excited to share that data with people, those thoughts.
So following up on Andrew's question, I wonder if we should be concerned about possible threshold effects where primates are not necessarily responding linearly to these pressures, but they suddenly collapse. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And yes, we definitely should be worried about threshold effects. my response would be to ask a question: how do you study threshold effects? You can look at them after they occurred, but how do you predict threshold effects? And I don't know the answer to that. So I'm sure thresholds will happen. In my data, I've seen nonlinearity. So, you expect populations to increase or decrease, but sometimes they go up and then down. So threshold effects are really critical, but hard to study with long-lived primates.
Thank you. One more question from Emmy, who is another graduate student here. Let's see. So she's also commenting on the difficulty of planning for long-term studies in the field.
Yeah, I'm reading the question myself. So if you're a grad student, you can't really plan for the long-term field studies. So you have different stages in careers. So a grad student, you're, okay, I'm struggling. Okay, I have to get some publications. Yeah, I hate to say this, but grad students probably shouldn't invest a lot of time in conservation, because conservation doesn't get you what's called a job. So you need to get publications. So you need to get academic publications. So you have to get academic publications to get the academic position. Once you have the academic position, you can then do more conservation. Planning for long-term studies can only happen once you as an academic are stable. It'd be great if you could plan otherwise, but you have to be financially, stable, socially stable. Your family has to be stable. I'm a really big advocate of making field sites relatively nice. If you want to work in a field site and you have to live in a tent for 30 years, you're probably not going to do it. So make your field site relatively nice, but of course that takes funding, etc. But as a grad student, concentrate on what gets you to the next stage of your career, which might not be what you actually want to do right now. You might want to help conservation, but if you help conservation but don't get to the next stage of your career, it's not going to lead you anywhere, and it's not going to lead conservation anywhere.
All right. Any final questions or comments for Dr. Chapman from the audience?
I've got one quick question. What's your big dream for the next 30 years?
Well, I don't think I think in 30-year time frames. I got a big dream for 5 years. So we have a bunch of grants out there to help reforest parts of Kibale. I think basically, I hope we can do some active reforestation in Kibale, remove some invasive plants, help the local community by giving them jobs and turning those invasive plants into briquettes. So
that's a really cool idea. Yeah.
But I have good 5-year plans, and then in 5 years, hopefully I'll have another good 5-year plans.
Yeah.
But I'll stress it. In those 5 years, it's going to be fun.
just make the plan for the next 30 years to be fun, and everything else will come together, I'm sure. I'm 100% on with that idea of having fun when you're doing your job. Your job should be fun.
Yes. I think you enjoyed your career, Mike. You seem like you had fun.
Always. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, great. So let's all thank Dr. Chapman for really a thought-provoking lecture today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Colin.
It was fun. That was excellent. I didn't mean to say that, but I did say that it was fun.
Okay.
Right.
Let me turn off the live streaming.